Kia koutou and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this session about facial recognition tech. My name is Thomas Beagle and I'm the chair of the NZ Council for Civil Liberties and we're the ones putting this event on. Before we start, to make sure you're aware that this may be surprising, the emergency exit is over that way and the bathrooms are all the way over that way. Two most important places to go. Now, I've been really looking forward to tonight, and part of the reason is because I still haven't made up my own mind about facial recognition tech and what we should be doing about it. You could say you're all here as an excuse, so that I can actually justify having this panel here to actually talk to me. I think it's timely because the technology is getting so much cheaper and so much more pervasive already. I think we're actually a little bit late here talking about what limitations we should be putting on it. So I guess if that's the case, we better get on with it. Because I look at how it's being used here, I look at how it's being used overseas, and I worry that it's taking us in directions we don't want to go. One of the interesting things to me about it is that facial recognition technology can be used without the consent of the people who are doing it. We can talk about, everyone carries their phones and their phones spy on them and so on, but of course, there's still a viable option not to carry one, but you can't really go anywhere without carrying your face. And therefore you can't opt out of it. COVID masking, of course, is making that quite interesting at the moment. And I mean, already we've got New Zealand supermarkets are actually scanning people as they go in and matching them against their own private blacklist of suspected shoplifters. And that's already happening. And I feel worried about things like the Chinese government using facial recognition to try and determine people's ethnicity so they can persecute the Uyghur people more. And it's downright creepy when you get companies like Clearview, and the company I don't know of in Russia, who are basically scanning huge amounts of images available on the net, and then actually making that available to either police departments, private companies, or even just as a paid search you can use to take any photo of someone and try and find out about them. So some of the questions I want to answer is this a technology that is basically rights neutral? Or are there certain uses that are always going to be a problem? And the real question is, can we avoid the worst outcomes through regulation or bans? Now we've got 4 speakers here who are going to come at it from different perspectives. They'll be speaking first, just briefly introducing what they have to say, and then we'll be taking questions and so on from the audience. Now the first speaker is Dr. Marcin Betkier. He's currently a law lecturer at Wellingtoria, and he has a background in IT. More importantly for us, he's one of the co-authors of the recent report, Facial Recognition Technology in New Zealand, Towards an Ethical and Legal Framework. Marcin, up to you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Yeah, the name of the university is a kind of challenge for all of us, probably. But Thomas, thank you for inviting me. Thomas kindly gave me a bit of time to give some sort of overview because of the fact that I was one of the contributors to that report. So basically, what we've done using the Manual of Law Foundation is to create some sort of overview what it is, how is it used in New Zealand and much broader, what it rights it impacts, and what are the current legislative framework which address that, and what could we recommend. That's a kind of systematical way of doing this, and don't want to read it to you, basically.
I'm sorry, I forgot to. Can everyone hear Marcin okay, or do we need to use the mic? People at the back particularly comment.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, that's good.
But you might want to alert people we're recording this for broadcast.
Thank you. We are recording this. And we are trying to make it available online. If you've got any objections to any of your content appearing in there, please tell us afterwards.
The content will be edited before going up so that we can ensure that it is captioned and that Te Reo and any names are spelt correctly. And so if there are any bits that need to be not recorded or edited out, that can also be alerted to us. There's contact details on the website of the Civil Liberties.
Okay, sorry about that, Marcin. I think carry on, sorry.
That's so good. I was just thinking maybe I should actually use it just for the sake of those for the recording.
Recording,
no? Yeah.
It's good to record.
Yeah, so maybe. Yep. Okay. Red light. we have online teaching right now, and I'm accustomed to the red light, which means that I'm recorded on the by the way. So, okay, to the chase. So what it is? What it is? I don't want to tell the story. What it is? It's actually remote biometrics. Yeah? So technology that can remotely detect the unique features of our faces and identify them or identify us and link that information to any other sources of our data, which is available. So what is different then with traditional biometrics is that can be used remotely. Yeah? We don't have to we don't have to know about that. We may not be aware that its facial recognition is actually in operation. And that's the problem, because it can be deployed, or the problem, that's the change. It can be deployed as an upgrade or addition to the existing camera systems, whether it's a CCTV camera, body-worn camera, smartphone, smart glasses, everything. And there are deployments. I just don't want to get deeper into technology because I have there is an expert sitting there, Andrew Chen, and he's a trove of knowledge about this technology, and I just don't want to try it. So that remote identification makes that actually the problem. And every technology can be used for good or for bad things. There's nothing like technology which is neutral. Technology somehow reflects the intentions of the creators, of the users of the technology. So it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. So arguments for actually using facial recognition technology are quite well known. We can use it for sort of streamlining and improving different identification technologies and processes in which we are identified. Border crossing, smile to pay, attendance tracking, security systems, and because it may recognize us without hassle, without fingerprints, without cards, and without anything more. It increases convenience, increases effectiveness, less errors, because there are some places where we identify people by faces, like on the border, yeah? And there are errors because people can identify those faces correctly, and that can actually make it better and faster. So there may be some, and there are surely some upsides of that. In policing, the same. Yeah? It increases the effectiveness of policing because police can see from those cameras who's there, which can be used for good and can be used for, or can have some sort of chilling effect on society as well. So that's one thing. And as I mentioned, it builds up on the fact somehow. It operates in public spaces. And in public spaces, we are used to carry our faces in public spaces, and we used to that people are recognizing them. So it's kind of natural for us. So what's different here? If we are going into the bar or to public space, and with my face, and I see my friend here, I recognize him, and it's great because I feel kind of supported in me. Yeah, there's some positive effect of that. So what's different if there is a facial recognition camera? So what's there? Yeah? Is there anything new in that? Well, there is anything new because we are used to. There is something new because we are used to recognize it in a kind of traditional way, people person to person. While when it's automated, it actually not only identifies us for the holder of the data or the operator of the system, it also links our face and our location as particular with any different sources of data they have about us. So they know where we are and who we are instantly. And so that's the difference. That it's automated and it's the link with other sorts of data. And there is somehow some sort of interest behind us to have some sort of privacy in public space, even of being unrecognized by everyone instantly, even if we are on the street, right? Because it used to be like that previously. So, and some people say it's a privacy interest in that, and it's covered by the right of privacy. But it can be framed by the different scholars differently. Some people say that it's an interest in being in obscurity, in being not recognized immediately. There's some sort of veil of ignorance around ourselves. So that's more or less what it is. Importantly, it's legal to use it in New Zealand, according to the current law. Law doesn't recognize it directly. Of course, there are laws that apply to that, like Privacy Act 2020, for instance. But if if the particular deployment of facial recognition technology is according to the principles of the Act, it's legal to deploy it and use it. The same with policing. There is there are no particular direct statutory requirements for the police to use it. Nothing which addresses that directly. There is a case law which is quite old, from 2011, 2012, from the times where there were rights of the police, Hammett case, which gives some sort of hope, maybe is the right word, that the judges can right now can state or can find the use of facial recognition live in public as breaching our reasonable, it's called reasonable expectation of privacy, and therefore breaching the right to freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, which is Section 21 of Bill of Rights. So this is our only hope, and it's a kind of vague right now whether it applies or not. There are no court cases around that, new court cases. I wouldn't bet on that, to be honest. So there is some sort of privacy interest. There is law which doesn't apply. There are risks. What are the risks? I don't want to talk more about the risk because there will be probably a lot of that covered. Well, but the risk is the risks to those risks are risks to our rights. The right to privacy is the first and probably the most obvious, because it recognizes us in public and it collects data about us, where we are. So someone knows and can pinpoint where we are, what we were doing, whether it was a church or abortion clinic or sex shop or gay bar or whatever. Yeah? So that can locate us and link that information with some particular sets of our other online data. Freedom of expression, thoughts, assembly and association. If, for example, facial recognition is used during the protest by the police, that suppresses the protest. It's a chilling effect because we are observed and we are recognized in a public place as having particular beliefs or particular in a particular protest. Freedom of movement is border control, security control. From discrimination, if the system is biased or inaccurate, which happens often, maybe not often, to start to say, but there are documented cases when of the system which is biased against mainly well, the system was built and was trained. Those systems were trained on white faces, and that the accuracy of recognizing white faces is much better. So it may be biased against people who have slightly different colors of the skin. It may change. It have changed already. It's hard to say right now. I don't have data about how does it look right now in those current systems. Maybe other panelists will help. So there are systems in actions. They infringe somehow on our rights, or pose risks to the rights. Just a quick note on the expression risk to the rights. It's not the same, and those risks have to be managed or avoided or addressed somehow. It's not the same as risk management in companies, which we usually kind of balance. Balance our rights, encroachment with our rights with some efficiencies. Risk to the rights is more about addressing potential abuses of rights of individuals and rights of collectives, because we are individuals and we have these privacy rights, but we as a collective of society, as a collective of right holders, also has rights. Yeah? And it was seen quite well, for example, in Cambridge Analytica case where Facebook was able, or Cambridge Analytica via Facebook was able to influence election process. Yeah? So collective rights of the whole society, not just privacy of each individual. This kind of transforms to higher level. So we have to address this somehow, and we found some sort of recommendation how to do this. So we identified some cross-cutting issues in the New Zealand law which we couldn't really address, and those are two. And one is the Māori data sovereignty and the treaty of Waitangi, which I have expert on here, so I don't want to go into that. We identified that we, in the current system, it simply recognize it very, very poorly. And the second thing, which is cross-cutting, is effective path of individual redress to human rights complaints. The human rights complaints. We don't have the as robust system as, for example, Europe, where there are separate courts and there is a path to recognize the breach of human rights. There is a bill right now in the parliament about declaration of inconsistency, which may somehow address this problem, but that's kind of separate thing which we need probably. So, recommendations. There is a spectrum of risk, and we risk to the rights, and we somehow have given a number of factors to recognize what is the risk, how big is the risk. And for example, small scale consent-based system of confirming identity gives or produces different risk than the big scale system covering the whole city based on CCTV cameras which tracks everything, and for example checks the face of individual with some other agency, database of another agency, which can be, for example, holding this data in different countries. So there are factors which are allowed to weigh that risk, small and big. And we have to recognize those risks. So the idea behind our recommendation is to recognize those risks proactively, because the court cases we cannot rely on common law, because it cannot address those risks before they are eventuated. We would like to have a system which addresses those risks before they actually happen. So to do that, well, there are two main ways of traditional public law ways of addressing the risk. This is or curbing the government, restraint and vigilance. So limiting things, amount of things the government can do, and increasing oversight. So those recommendations go exactly those ways. And so first, to create the category of biometric information which bears increased risk for individual because it identifies us and give some additional protection to that particular category. And it's possible to do it on the basis of current Privacy Act, because Privacy Commissioner can issue so-called code of conduct, which may address, for example, remote biometrics, and define what is biometrics. It's section 32 of the new act. Second, provide individual. That's also a big wish for New Zealand privacy law. Provide individuals with additional control, privacy rights. In fact, the rights which are, for example, in Europe, rights to erasure, rights to object to data processing. So we can say to the data holders, I don't want you to have the data, erase them. We don't have it right now, and that would be something which each individual could do for herself or himself. Establish oversight body. I'm close. Establish an oversight body, and we recommended something which is called biometrics commissioner, but in fact it can be another function of privacy commissioner to oversee state agencies using biometrics. So that's the oversight method. And something which I'm really particularly excited, maybe it's the wrong word about, is to implement a system of high quality privacy impact assessments. So the systems which are being implemented, facial recognition systems, would have to be assessed against risks, and not just risks for the agency that uses this, but risks on the individuals, risk to the rights, and risk to the society. And that system can be defined by the law and framed by the law in a way that those privacy impact assessments should be public and should be transparent, so each of us can have oversight on that. So that's the vigilance part. And the last thing, I think there are two more. One is information sharing agreements. So we assess that the Privacy Act as just look at the angle of how government agencies are sharing information which can be used for facial recognition technology, and we realize that there are 4 different schemas of information sharing there, and they are inconsistent. There's no oversight on some information sharing there, especially on law enforcement information sharing. There is no oversight of Privacy Commissioner, and for us, we recommended that it should be unified somehow, and that additional or regular oversight of Privacy Commissioner should be there. And the last thing is a set of recommendations towards policing, which my friend Nessa Lynch, the main author of the report, was particularly keen at, is actually to implement some sort of moratorium on the use of automatic live facial recognition technology by the police before or until we will have some sort of regulatory framework. to do this. Yeah? So, and particular recommendation how that regulatory framework in the or for the statutory regulatory framework for the police should look like. So they just a sentence, they shouldn't be completely free to use that. They should use it for particular goals, for particular circumstances where the risk is high enough, and only when the statutory law allows them to do this. And I guess that's probably what.
Thank you, Marcin. That's good.
Yeah.
Good. Next up, we've got Karaitiana Taiuru, an academic who works across fields including artificial intelligence ethics, colonisation, data sovereignty, property rights, and tikanga Māori. Karaitiana recently published Māori Cultural Considerations for Facial Recognition Check, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Tēnā koutou katoa, Yurio, Ngāti Toa, Ngā Te Kahungunu rawa ko Ngai Tautohu Tūturu Iwi and ko Karaitiana Taiuru. So, yeah, my name's Karaitiana and I have whakapapa links around this area, down south and further up north. So, I said I've got 5 minutes to give you a brief overview of the paper that or the article that I wrote on Māori issues with facial recognition. So there's, I am totally opposed to facial recognition, and on the basis that historically Māori have always been discriminated against with all aspects of the government system, whether it's the police, the education, social services, justice, just the whole range. And all I see happening at the moment is that Māori are going to be discriminated against again if we don't actually speak up and do something and say something now. I saw the same issues happening when the World Wide Web came to New Zealand, and naively I thought, no, other people will fix this and say something. And unfortunately, no one ever did. And now Māori are more likely to be discriminated against, harassed, lack of access to technologies, just the whole range of things to the internet and the World Wide Web, and simply because we didn't talk about it when it first came in. So in terms of government facial recognition, I think that we need to first of all we need to address the issue that the algorithm charter is worthless from a Māori perspective. It's some nice words on a piece of paper, but the point is that there was a group of Māori academics who were consulted for that charter. Unfortunately, those academics never had any interaction with the real world in terms of Māoridom. They just, it was, in my opinion, it looked like it was a box-ticking exercise. It's also important to note that the chief government data steward reversed his predecessor's decision that data is a taonga, and so the current data steward refuses to say that data is a taonga, which creates further issues. So I think the first thing that the government needs to do is enact a te tiriti clause for facial recognition. Under te tiriti guarantees sovereignty and rights to tikanga Māori and to our taonga. So our images, our face is a taonga, and we are not getting any sovereignty with facial recognition. Another issue is a lot of Māori, it's becoming more and more popular now that Māori will have facial tattoos, tā moko, moko kauai, a woman, and there's definitely intellectual property rights associated with facial recognition and those images. We know from overseas that anyone who's not a standard Caucasian looking probably male is going to be discriminated against with facial recognition. So we already know that Māori Pacific Islanders are going to be discriminated against with facial recognition. The police seem to have this reluctance to engage publicly and, according to media reports, even with their superiors about facial recognition systems. So we have no idea if the facial recognition system is actually going to recognise individual moko on a face. or whether a system's going to say, discriminate, say that person's got a full face mataroa. So if the system recognises everyone as the same person with the mataroa, or every female with the kauai will be treated as the same person, we don't know that. In our tikanga, our cultural beliefs are that our tattoos, our moko, it ties us back to our families, it represents who we are, and there's a spiritual connection to that. As well as our faces, there's a spiritual connection if you take an image, a photo of someone's face. So if we were talking about other people's religious rights, there would be a huge outcry. Unfortunately, with Māori religious beliefs, they were made illegal in New Zealand from 1908 to 1965. So we have generations of Māori who are too scared to talk about Māori religion, or they were brought up without tikanga and cultural knowledge. Had the Tohunga Suppression Act not been enacted and made our religious beliefs illegal, we would have a lot. It wouldn't just be me sitting here talking to you about this. It would be, there'd be a wide outcry about it. So basically, our religious beliefs state that you shouldn't take an image of a person, you shouldn't take someone else's moko, and you definitely shouldn't put it and mix it up with other people's faces and other people's images. Especially mixing the living people with the dead people. It's in our theological beliefs, it's actually really bad luck. So, in terms of government, I would expect that there is a tikanga Māori oversight committee with all facial recognition systems in the government. That acts in a very similar manner to the proposed Māori DNA and criminal investigations submission made by the Law Commission, where tikanga Māori, where cultural practices have to be considered and implemented throughout the systems. There's a number of future risks as well that I'm concerned about with private entities. So, there's supermarkets, a number of retail shops scanning our images, facial recognition images. So there's a huge amount of room for cultural discrimination. So we have issues already of images online with people with moko kauai, taumoko on their faces. The images are already being commercialised on shower curtains, on beer can, on alcohol products, on a number of different things. Just end of last year, a well-known Māori reporter from TVNZ had her face painted and sold at an art gallery because she had a moko kauai. So these things are happening and they're real, but with facial recognition systems, it's just it could be a whole lot worse. And when you consider so then we're also just worried about issues like deep fakes, people who engage with digisexuals, employment databases or recruitment processes which should look at facial recognition systems and decide whether a candidate is suitable for a job or not based on their facial movements. Now, there's room here for any employer to say, well, we don't want anyone with a moko on their face, so we'll just immediately remove them. We've also got people with moko being used in emojis and game characters. And perhaps more of a concern for me is we already know that we have killer drones and killer bots, and the technology's there, it's being used overseas. There's a serious possibility that Māori could be discriminated against with those sort of artificial intelligences. And just finally, I think there's also a risk that private companies could on-sell our images, and those could be used for virtual holograms. We'd have the dead recreated, spun up with artificial intelligence based on people's writings. I think there's a whole a whole lot of future issues which haven't been considered that we need to consider now. Thank you.
Thank you, Karaitiana. Our third speaker tonight is Lisa Woods from Amnesty International. I'm sure I don't need to introduce Amnesty, but they have recently kicked off a global campaign to ban certain uses of facial recognition tech. And I'm hoping that Lisa's going to be able to tell us something about their thinking.
Thank you. Kia ora, everyone. So Amnesty's position on this is that we're calling for a ban on the use of facial recognition technology for identification purposes. Our concerns that we have really already been outlined, so they're around privacy, discrimination, particularly around racial bias and accuracy and racism. Also have concerns around the rights around freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly. I was reading lines somewhere before that talked about, depending on how this technology is used and how it's rolled out, that it could actually mean, in effect, the automatic compulsory registration of people when you attend a protest. And you can imagine the type of chilling impact that would have on those rights. So to that end, Amnesty International has launched the global campaign called Ban the Scam, and I will talk about that in a little bit, but I'm just going to quickly talk about what's happening globally, because there is momentum there, and that's something with our campaign that we're hoping to build on and support. So starting with what's happening in some of our global institutions, so the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression has called for a moratorium on this type of technology, and the UN International Telecommunications Union and the industry standards body IEEE, which is a member of the union, are working on standards. So those developments are welcome. And I'm just going to quickly give a really rough overview of what's happening in a couple of countries to give a bit of a flavour as well for what's happening. So starting with the UK, I think it's important to note that Scotland has a moratorium on this technology for enforcement, but this is in contrast to the rest of the UK, where the technology is in use, but with no specific legislative framework around it. But what is interesting is there has been a court case on this, which I think was the first of its kind with this technology. And I'm going to attempt to sum up in one sentence, I think, what was quite a complex case with lots of different considerations, which I know is probably a surefire way to fail or to be challenged. But essentially what the court found on appeal was that the policies and the act that the police relied on were not sufficient, and the court raised concerns around the breadth of discretion that was there, the processes that the police had used to consider issues such as bias. So on the one hand, I guess from a civil liberties perspective, you could say, well, that's positive, but actually on the other hand, I think it sort of leaves the door open here in the terms of whether or not there's the developmental policies that are more detailed and address the issues that the court has raised, and whether or not that would enable that technology to be used. But I think what's also really interesting in the UK, that there have been a number of official and political calls around this technology. So for example, the UK Information Commissioner and the House of Commons, their Science and Technology Committee, have essentially asked for a, push the pause button while we consider the ramifications and the impact of this technology. What's also notable is that there's a piece of legislation before the House of Lords, which has had its first reading and is calling for a moratorium on this technology. So stuff is certainly happening there, and Amnesty is working with a whole lot of other civil society organisations to really push for that ban on the use of this technology for enforcement purposes there. Now travelling to the United States, so this technology is in wide use across the country in many different ways. I think what is notable there, and particularly in the context of the Black Lives Matter, there has been a growing awareness and spotlight on the potential harms and impacts, or actual harms, that this technology is having, and there have been some examples that have come through highlighting those harms. For example, a prominent Black Lives Matter protester said that the police used this technology to track him to his home. There's been a case of a man arrested with the faulty use of the technology. So that's showing the real harms. And what I think is also interesting is that three major companies over there, which is IBM, Amazon and Microsoft, I think, if I'm right, have announced that they're going to stop providing this technology to the police until there are sufficient safeguards in place. As I understand it, they're not necessarily the major provider, so I don't think this is going to disrupt the supply chains, but nonetheless it is notable. And in terms of what's happening in the legislative regulatory environment there, things are happening, but it's tended to be on an ad hoc basis at the local level, though notably in Massachusetts, there's one state here that has implemented quite a comprehensive limitation on the use of this technology with enforcement. And there's other things happening all across the country in terms of a city level. So San Francisco has also banned the use of the technology by police and other state agencies. Other cities are taking quite different approaches. So some, for example, are limiting the use of this technology with footage, for example, gained by drones or on body cameras worn. So there are things happening there. The last country I'm going to look at is China. So China has quite vast surveillance capability, and that's including with facial recognition technology. And Amnesty has been very concerned about the use of that technology in terms of tracking and tracing the Uyghur population, as Andrew pointed out, but also its use in Hong Kong, where it was used to identify protesters, and even where protesters would cover their face, the authorities then introduced a ban on face coverings. So that really highlights, in terms of those three examples, where the challenges and the real potential harms of this technology is. So in terms of our campaign, we launched our Ban the Scam campaign, and the way it's operating is it's happening in waves, and each wave focuses on a different location around the world. So the first wave focuses on New York, and that's where it's being launched. And there's a really cool online hub that I invite you to go check out. Lots of information on the campaign, how to take action and so forth. But what they're doing, which I think is really cool, is working with the citizens there to map where this technology is around the city so they can see the pervasiveness of it, but also link it with very real testimonies of the actual harm this technology has had and the impact it's having. So here we're thinking about how we can roll that campaign out domestically, so watch this space.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, finally we've got Dr. Andrew Chen, a research fellow with Karaitiana, the Centre for Informed Futures. His PhD, The Computers Have 1,000 Eyes, was about using video for tracking people, and he's currently the go-to person to the media when discussing COVID-19 related tech.
Thank you very much, Tēnā koutou katoa. My notes are all completely wrong now, so I will be talking I mean, Marcin brought up this point that facial recognition is biometrics. And I would say that biometrics is this broader class of technologies of which facial recognition is one of them. Biometrics are identifiers that you generally can't change about yourself. There are always exceptions. You can go get plastic surgery or whatever, but in general terms, they identify you uniquely. So I did a PhD in computer vision systems for what we called video analytics, which was just a cover term for surveillance. And we were applying that towards person tracking applications in commercial contexts. And we didn't actually use faces, or we didn't need to use faces. We were doing tracking essentially based on the color and texture of clothing, and then tying that to the loyalty card or the RFID card that a person was swiping when they went to an office space. And so I think to some extent, yes, we do need to be concerned about facial recognition, but also we need to be aware that there are lots of other technologies some have already been around for a really long time, that also fall into this class of things that need to be regulated carefully. So that could be biological things like fingerprints or DNA. It could be something technical like cell phone tracking or voice recognition. These are all sorts of similar things that actually need to be regulated together. And I do think that facial recognition has this particularly emotive element that means that it gets more attention than other similar technologies because we use faces to recognize each other, and that's something that humans rely on and feels like a very personal thing. I've been talking to some people and saying, well, DNA testing and tracking for like police use is actually probably just as invasive, if not more invasive. But for a lot of people, DNA is this magical thing that biologists tell them exists because you can't see, taste, feel, hear it at all, and therefore feels less invasive in a way. So clearly, from what we've heard today and also from what you may have heard in the past, I think that there do need to be better rules around how we regulate the use of technologies like facial recognition. But we do need to proactively regulate the general class of biometric technologies rather than playing regulatory whack-a-mole each time something comes up as being the next hot technology to regulate. And I actually do probably tend to be a little bit more moderate than my panelists here, in that I do think that there are some legitimate uses of facial recognition technology. For example, searching a database of people for fraud mitigation and passport applications or visa applications is something that is probably relatively low risk, and as long as there is a person still in the loop, then the harms are somewhat mitigated. I'm not going to say that it's perfect, but it's one where possibly the benefits outweigh the harms. The challenge is in identifying where we as a society want to draw the line, and this is an audience who I think will probably be more predisposed to saying we value our privacy, that's why you're at an event hosted by the Council for Civil Liberties. But generally speaking, people are quite happy to give up, they're quite happy to sacrifice quite a lot of privacy in exchange for what is really not that much convenience, as a general rule, right? And so that's something that I think we as a society need to have more of a conversation about before we can go too far ahead and say, okay, well, obviously we need to ban this. Because otherwise you're going to be alienating a lot of people and isolating a lot of people who may otherwise see a lot of value in using these sorts of technologies. And to sort of come to my point that I had at the end is that I do think that a moratorium is appropriate, but we have to be aware that like, a lot of things are going to break. The horse has already bolted from the cart to some extent, and that facial recognition is in a lot of systems. And so if New Zealand were to go out alone and put a ban on facial recognition, probably Apple would stop selling iPhones in this country because the iPhones come with facial recognition. Probably you'd have issues at the border with smart gates no longer being able to be used. So it's not just we can have a blanket ban. There are these uses that are already out there that people are going to say are very useful and convenient. And now your moratorium has to have lots of carve-outs and say, okay, well, this is allowed, that's not allowed. It's just something that we have to be aware of, that in order to get that sort of social license, to get everybody on board with this sort of ban, we have to consider how it's actually going to impact the lives of everyday people. So I think it's also, just from a slightly more technical perspective, I was going to go into sort of the differences between when this technology works, which is largely the realm of science fiction and the theory developed by ethicists, and when the technology doesn't work, which is more the status quo that we have now. Facial recognition systems, well, depending on who you are, tend to work a lot better or a lot worse than you think that they do. And that's because accuracy doesn't have a standard definition anymore. It's a definition that academics originally had that then got warped by salespeople and vendors who wanted to try to sell a product. In controlled conditions, with predictable facial orientations, with consistent lighting, and with the right sort of training and testing data, facial recognition systems can be 99% accurate, and that's what the salespeople will go out with. But in the real world, with all the messiness of real images on real populations, it's not quite that accurate. On real world data sets, in academic literature, if you've got 80 or 90% accuracy, you'd be pretty chuffed with that, and you'd be able to get a paper out and say that you'd advance the literature. And so there's a question there on sort of what accuracy rate is actually acceptable in deployment. Do we need 99% accuracy in order for people to accept these systems? Is 80 or 90% actually acceptable? It depends on the sorts of decisions that you're going to make as a result of having this information. And that's where it may make a difference between whether we consider that it's the police or the state that have control of the system versus a corporate entity that may make a different type of decision with the information that they're collecting. And I just want to acknowledge, certainly most models have some underlying bias at the moment, mostly in the training data. And so we would expect that the accuracy rate for certain segments of the population will be lower. When I say that an accuracy rate is 80%, that would be an average. It may be 90-95% for white male faces, and maybe 60-50% for people of colour. It's not very good. But I think a general sort of thought experiment that I like to think about is like about these computers having bias models is to ask whether or not humans actually have the same level of facial recognition capability as well. I think that the fact that there is a stereotype where people will say all blah people look the same is not something to just be rejected as racism. It also points to that person having had an insufficiently diverse training set, which is a technical way of saying that they haven't seen enough people of that particular ethnicity. And so if we give computers the same sorts of data sets, why would we expect them to do anything different? There's a lot of arguments there around whether or not the failures in these algorithms are in the models or in the data sets I tend to think that we can go a lot further in terms of improving these data sets to try and resolve these sorts of bias problems. And by the way, if you don't think that you have a racism problem, consider sheep. You probably can't tell the difference between two sheep, but farmers reportedly can learn the faces of their sheep and start to distinguish between them. And there's research done at the University of Otago on a sheep face data set to try and do facial recognition on sheep, and the computer seems to do a pretty good job at it. So because they're getting a better data set than what we mostly have received in the course of our lifetimes, the computer's doing a better job than we would. So I think that's when you consider if the systems are not working well, which is the situation that we have now, where we have issues of bias, we have issues of robustness against environmental conditions, we have issues of false positive matches where a system thinks that a person is somebody else when they're not. And that's the technology side. I think it's important to follow that logic through to the impact of what that means in terms of a decision. So does that mean that an employee now can't get into an office space? Does it mean that the police can't track people when it's raining? Does it mean that somebody might be incorrectly arrested? These are the sorts of issues that need to be incorporated, that need to be considered alongside the technology issues. The technologists will focus on one, the ethicists will focus on the other. They need to be collectively discussed in order for us to make progress on making these technologies better. Then we can start to consider, okay, if the technology is improving, then it will get more accurate over time, and those technological areas will disappear. I think we're not there yet. A lot of people cite Big Brother, that's science fiction. It's hard to make a prediction of when science fiction will become science, but the technologies are getting better all the time, which is why I do think that a moratorium overall is appropriate, not to stop the research and development of these tools, but to give ourselves some time to figure out where those boundaries are, what limitations that we want to put in place around what is one of the most invasive biometric technologies available that we can dream of. And then to also say, well, could we put in similar rules around other biometric technologies as well? And we're not starting from scratch. We do have good rules around like DNA collection, for example, and we could draw inspiration from that and apply that where it's appropriate to facial recognition. I think that the idea of a biometrics commissioner is something that's well overdue, as something that would be able to respond more quickly than legislation. But overall, I mean, I agree with the comments made here that a moratorium is not out of place for the issue that faces us now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. That was good. I'm not going to bother trying to sum up there and give some common themes and stuff. I might as well get on to the discussion part of it. Now, we will be taking audience questions. I will actually accept very brief comments as well. I'm a bit different in that way. Whether your questions or your comments, it has to be brief, because I'm going to have to repeat it back for the benefit of the microphone, and my short-term memory is terrible. So keep it very quick. Does anyone want to start? Okay.
Is it turned on?
Yeah, you don't particularly need to use the mic. Okay.
Oh, thank you, for recording. Kia ora koutou, Kay Jones. Thank you all for so many sort of wonderful thoughts. I see a couple of problem areas. One is who is doing the use of facial recognition technology and building the databases, and who might be using the results that they've done. So when Lisa was talking about the overseas picture, there's been a couple of court cases recently. EU Digital Rights took a case in Hamburg which found that Clearview had exceeded the law in scraping images from databases, and they had they're a private sector company that provide police with surveillance information. Clearview had also been found guilty in Canada of exceeding the bounds of the law, basically taking more than they were entitled to, getting from different sources. And the thing is, they've been found to have broken the law, but that won't stop them because they're not fined or really sort of, big barriers to them continuing to do it. And for them to continue offering what they're doing all around the country, or around the world, including Aotearoa New Zealand. So that being said, what can we be promoting to either government to be controlling police about what they can use this for, or to actually get some kind of normalising of, hey, this isn't actually a good thing? because on the way here, I was at the airport and there was a camera took in my photo, the thing I just paid. I know that if I go to my supermarket, they're doing the same thing. No consent, no sort of information to me. So this is normal. But how can we actually share concerns with people outside this room that there may be questions? So one is, what do we do about the police who may be using this private sector sort of companies? And two, about how do we actually raise the issues for public awareness? Anybody can answer.
Now that was a long question.
I'm sorry.
So the quick summary is that with people already doing things, what can government do, or what can we do to normalise behaviours that we want to control it?
Yeah, well, that's just probably a fragment of that. About the Clearview, and Clearview has been found guilty, or has been found in breach of different privacy regulations across the world, because what they actually did, the method of data collection, of scraping the publicly available data sources, so Facebook and others. So those who are presenting our faces, or they are accessible from public. And the problem here is actually in law. I mean, to be honest, in New Zealand, there will be a problem if we're finding them guilty or in breach of the Act, of the privacy principles, unless we find that their method of actually collecting data was unreasonably intrusive. I would say yes, but there might be different views on that. And we don't have, as I mentioned before, we don't have individual rights that will develop here in New Zealand, so we don't have consent developed as much as in Canada, for example, or in Europe. So Clearview, in fact, I think it should be separated. One, because they have been found in breach of privacy because of the method of data collection. That's all. And in the US, with no federal privacy law for private sector, they are running in the wild. So that's one thing. So what we can do for the Clearview thing is we can beef up our privacy rights. And as a member of Privacy Foundation New Zealand, we've been asking for that for a long time. It's not a new thing here. What shall we do to address it to the public? I don't know, actually. That's probably you.
You can support ban the scan campaign. So one of the things, I mean, that's the big question that Amnesty asks is, you know, we've got this call, a notion that's around calling on a ban around identification purposes, not verification purposes. But the big thing that we're always confronted with a campaign is how can you create the conditions that push for that unusual political action. And so the theory of change really focuses on trying to illustrate the pervasiveness and the reality of this technology, which is where that mapping goes, so people can actually see it's happening. But what's equally important is really showing the real life stories about the harm, so not the theoretical stuff that could happen, the actual everyday stuff that's happening to people. And we think that's going to be critical for creating the pressure from the public that's going to eventually compel political action. So what we see with these types of things is you often need that to get that sea change of public pressure in order to finally push the politics over the line for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think just to answer your first question, Kay, the Clearview will stop operating when there is no longer a market for their services. Right? And so things like moratoriums and bans will help with that because if people are not buying their services, they will not operate, right? I guess the challenge is that the vast majority of Clearview's income comes from the United States. And so that's the context that they're operating in. The main reason why they are not operating in New Zealand was because the police tried it and it didn't work. And so they decided not to use it, right? But that's not a guarantee that another facial recognition algorithm won't be used by, for example, New Zealand police. And I believe the New Zealand police do use it for database matching, but they have always said that they do not use it for live CCTV processing. And that's the line that they draw.
I guess for Māori, we just need to keep on pushing for Māori data sovereignty rights, and just keep on encouraging the rejuvenation of our traditional knowledge, which is, as I said before, it has previously been illegal and kept secret, but now it's becoming normalised and we do talk about it. For example, in 1960, if I was sitting here talking about this, I would have been arrested. It would have been against the law. So, yeah, we just need to keep on pushing within our own circles.
Okay, next up. Person on lavender.
Side.
Right.
Do you need me to speak in the microphone or no?
Just ask your question.
So, thank you all for sharing your insights tonight. You know, I know we talk about banning this technology or putting a moratorium on it, but it's a technology that's broken. Fundamentally, it is just broken. So when we have a car and the brakes don't work, we have to get it fixed. Otherwise, we won't pass the walk, we can't get it registered. Why is it we're not saying, fix this technology? You mentioned that it's only good 65% of the time for people like me. That's not acceptable. That's the broken brakes. Moratoriums and all of that is only staying the problem. It's not fixing it. So how come from a technology perspective we're not looking at fixing the problem? Getting better data sets would be one way. And saying if you want to drive this vehicle here in New Zealand, or you want to use this technology in New Zealand, it's got to pass a WAF of some kind.
I think our microphone's really working on that one, so who wants to answer that one?
Sure. I think that there's 2 points to make there. One is, so a moratorium delays the clock, right? A moratorium says, let's pause on actually using this technology. It doesn't say we can no longer do research and development. So I think that is what is necessary to fix the problems that we're talking about. It does also presuppose that these problems are fixable. And depending on who you talk to, some people would say that these are fundamental issues that can never be fixed, and other technologists who are a bit more optimistic will say, let's just keep doing research. I think the second point to mention is that there is a significant lag between the pace of academic research and what is available as a commercial product. And so the facial recognition algorithms that are currently being used in commercial products were probably in the literature about 5 or 6 years ago. And so it will take time, right? I think it's not, a lot of people are aware that these are issues and they're trying to do something about it. But it's not like a car where they know how to fix the issue. It's not like your brakes are broken on the car, okay, we'll get new brakes. There are fundamental, difficult, tricky math questions that need to be addressed. And to be fair to some researchers, every time they try to fix the dataset problem, you get a clear view, and people get upset at how they collected the images for the dataset. So there's a bit of give and take there around sort of, okay, there are pressures on how they fix the problem as well, not just they can find a way to fix the problem. The method with which they fix the problem is also under contention.
I'll just add something to that. I mean, I think from our perspective as well, I mean, even if you take accuracy issues and all those aside, there's still the concern for us that we're operating in a context where there's structural issues around racism and discrimination and so forth. And no matter how accurate or types of issues that we fix within the technology, when you're operating in that context, the technology is still going to exacerbate those harms.
Yeah, just to address the moratorium issue, because that's, I think we need to be clear or very precise or more precise in language what actually we want to ban. And we nuance in a way we address we describe that scope. Because there are where the discrimination is in play, there is high risk, and that's why we address and we ask for moratorium for police use for an automated facial recognition. And I think the moratorium should be used very, very sparingly, because it stops the technology from developing. So it should be used where the risks are high or very high. When the risks are medium, for example, or low, it's a policy decision. But we shouldn't just we shouldn't just say, and it was just the choice of words, yeah. But the technology is broken completely. It's just that we should address that moratorium where it's really appropriate in a way that we should protect people and where the risks are high. But we should, in general, the technology will improve over time, and we should somehow allow the technology to improve, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't, because technology could provide in 5 years or so 99% of accuracy, and it will still be invasive in a way that it will breach our privacy rights. It will recognize us and link with the data and so on. So we have to address this as well. Yeah? So there are some legal methods and non-legal methods of addressing that. Yeah? So recognizing those kind of nuances. Yeah? So what exactly we want to put the moratorium on? Because not on everything, but on I would say on uses of high risk or medium risk or very high risk. Or it depends on our own choice. Yeah? And somehow, and Andrew was talking about it, that somehow differentiate between or distinguish between two things. One is that technology completeness or insufficiency right now, and the state of art which we will achieve in a couple of years, because we won't be having the same arguments about racism and so on when the technology get to the point when it will have 29% for every race. So and we have to address this scenario as well, because that still breaches our privacy rights and intrudes in our space, yeah, makes the public space not really public. Yeah?
I think just very quickly, yeah, I agree. There should be a moratorium, and I mean it's not so much me, but my immediate family, my extended family, they'll be discriminated against as well. And it's easy to say, well, just worry about the high risk, but who's going to be in the high risk? It's probably going to be my family. It's probably going to be you. So I definitely agree. We should put a hold on things and get it right first of all. We are playing on people's lives, not just figures and stats on a computer.
I think it is worth noting that we are all for some form of ban or moratorium, but we're all defining it slightly differently. So, we're not all saying the same thing.
Which I think 99% right. But how can it happen when IT is mostly staffed by white males? And that is systemic. And so, I come from a user experience background, and I hate to say this, but when we test products, we're mostly testing it on white people. We're not testing it on diversity, so we don't know what those concerns are. And these people who are creating these products in laboratories, where they're not surrounded by the population, how can we get to that point where people are not discriminated against? How can it be 99% accurate?
Well, a bit evade the question in a way that I'm a technologist as well, and but I guess that my point was that we should be ready for that scenario if it happens. Yeah? Because basically, if we fix on the argument that technology is imperfect and discriminates, well, it may be addressed at some point. And I think that it doesn't really solve the problem. That the problem with facial recognition is more than it just discriminates. It discriminates and it's bad. But it also fundamentally changes the way we experience public spaces. In a way, and even if it's accurate, fully accurate, and doesn't discriminate, it's still not okay. Yeah? It still infringes my privacy interest. I can frame it this way, or obscurity interest, or whatever, or infringes my privacy rights. So that's my point. Yeah? I agree with you that there is a problem with IT industry, and it's a systemic problem, and I don't actually honestly believe that they are ready to, or that it's possible for them to address it by themselves. It doesn't look like, at least looking at who is in the staff of Google, Facebook, and so on. It's just exactly like that.
Thank you.
Nelson Level?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what your point there is, reflecting on what I noted before, in that there is the school of thought that these problems are inherent and are not fixable, versus the school of thought that if we just keep doing more research and development, it will be fixed eventually, right? At least in the academic community, like the security, privacy, ethics stuff is very prevalent. At every AI conference, there is a track dedicated to these issues, and people are talking about them. And you would have to be very, very deep in a cave to have not heard about these issues if you're an AI researcher, right? I would also note that right now, by number, the majority of AI researchers would not be white. That's just a reflection of who happens to sit inside research institutions right now. But they are still using data sets that may be biased in some way, and that's affecting their ability to design these systems, right? But I imagine that if we were having this debate in China, for example, not that we would be allowed to, but if we were, they would not be pointing to a whiteness problem. Right. So there's a question there of like, okay, well, how much of it is technical, and then how much of it is also important to be acknowledged is the systemic racism that is inherent in the people who are working on the system, right? And I think those are just slightly separate issues.
Anyone else want to say anything about that? Next question, please.
For me, it's not only the systemic racism within the industry, but the question is also how we use it. So a lot of you have spoken about convenience, and that's always those in the power. And we already live in a racist, sexist, in this country, a colonised white society. And so, yeah, regardless of fixing the car, the moratorium needs to be there. We need to stop this because it doesn't matter if it works 99% of the time. It's who's using it, who is it convenient for? Why do we need to know who's gathering in public spaces?
We need to fix
The question is convenience.
We need to fix the car and the drivers, right?
The drivers need to die.
Let's just challenge a bit that, because I kind of started teaching on Monday and maybe get into that. There was a case of that police in India found 3,000 children using facial recognition technology in a couple of days, missing children. How about that? There were, well, it's a kind of stark example, yeah?
Yeah,
Example that, yeah,
an extreme example.
An extreme example. On the other hand, well, we surely would like to have those found. We would like to have found the 3,000
And then other
children.
sources of data and go.
Yeah, so it's always a balance. Yeah, it's always
Is that an example of the car working?
Sorry,
Is that an example of the car working?
that's an example of that's what they were stating. That's an example of a good use, yeah, or a particular benefit which could be from facial recognition. So, and there may be more, yeah, of course. Yeah, this one is a kind of extreme because it's about children and we care about children and so on. It's emotional. I'm sorry about this, but I thought that it's a provocation.
Any more panelists want to ask that one? Moving on.
Yeah, I've got two questions. So, it seems like there's a good deal of agreement regarding the need for a moratorium. If that's the case, what is the next step that needs to be taken in making that happen? And also, my other question is, if a moratorium were to be put into action, are there any ideas on what the end criteria would be for ending that moratorium? So what obviously a moratorium is a temporary measure. What needs to happen for the moratorium to be resolved?
One, lobby your local member of parliament. Write lots of emails to the Minister of Justice. Two is establish something like a biometrics commissioner who can decide at what point it is good enough. I would be very reticent to say, let's define when the algorithms are 99% accurate on this data set, we're allowed to use it again. Right? I don't think we can set a technical endpoint for the moratorium. It would have to be something that is evaluated by at least one expert, if not more.
Yeah, I mean, the lobbying thing is important, and I think what we need to make sure that we see that this issue is addressed politically. You know, it's not just sort of kicked down the road or thrown into an operational manner, and we don't want to see policies developed in silos around different agencies. It's needs to be that statewide approach that government really grabs with both hands and takes responsibility for.
Andrew.
I think we're slightly teasing out the two different purposes of a moratorium. But I think let's be very clear. There's a moratorium during which time technology companies and researchers will spend their time making technology more accurate and thinking about the uses of that technology, and that's what they will do. But the purpose of a moratorium for us as a society is to give us time to reflect on what are we willing to define as the boundaries of acceptable use of such a technology. I don't think it's acceptable just to say we create a biometrics commissioner, because we see problems when we put all of society's decision making into the hands of one regulator. We had until about 2009 in this country, when National wound it up, the Bioethics Council, which looked at issues of things like xenotransplantation and GMOs in crops. Increasingly, society is facing issues around biometric issues, and I think as a country we have very shallow forms of democratic engagement, and what the Bioethics Council did was to go out and talk to people about what their values are, what do they think is important, in order to then guide policymakers on construction of a legal framework. So I think, for me, we need to be very clear that the purpose of the moratorium is to have that reflection as a country about what do we want to see.
Response to that? Yeah, there was a comment more.
And maybe that we're making an assumption that the democratic process follows. Maybe that assumption is not valid.
Okay, I'm going to make a provocative comment because I've been hearing about this moratorium, so I'm actually more on the side at the moment. I'm tending to more say we should have a ban, outright ban, on the use of unconsented facial recognition in public spaces. And I'm not sure if I would ever want to undo that once the technology improves or once we put protection. I think that might be one of the bottom levels of protection we want. And by an unconsented ban, by unconsented in public places, that would protect the public spaces. And possibly, they might extend public spaces to some places like shopping malls and so on as well. Does anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, by private or by public actors?
Both.
Both.
Private
Because
and public.
the problem with the technology problem, just only one sentence to that. The technology problem with consent for facial recognition is it's a kind of vicious circle, because actually to recognize that people has consent, that you have to scan the face. And you cannot scan the face without consent. So which means that you would like to actually forbid to use that in public spaces.
Yes.
So this is just a nice way of framing that, but it's a ban.
Yes. Anyone else want to comment on that as a step beyond moratoriums or not?
Well, Amnesty supports the technology for identification purposes, which I think is important. But can I just go back to the democratic point that Andrew was making just really quickly? So I think what's really important for us about those assumptions of democracy is even, for us it's really important about who's around the table with this, and that the Māori data sovereignty issues are really at the store here, and even following a normal democratic process, that does not mean those who should be around the table are around the table. So I think with this, that's sort of one of the foremost considerations that we need to make sure is considered in this issue.
Miriam, you had a question?
I was wondering if one of the reasons why facial recognition and DNA testing in particular feels so creepy is that it's not just information about you, it's about your ancestors and about the rest of your family. And I'm wondering Tiana, if you've got comments on that, and maybe Andrew as well, about other types of biometrics.
Sure. Yeah, so definitely from a Māori perspective, our DNA is sacred. It is a taonga, and as you say, it's not just ours. And from a Te Hunga perspective, I don't own the DNA inside my body. It's owned it's collectively owned by my family, my hapu, my iwi. And we also believe there's a spiritual connection to that data, whether it's digitised or whether it's still in the biological state. And exactly the same thing with the images, face images. So, for example, our photos. If you go to a marae, there's photos of dead people on the wall, but there's never a photo of a living person, and there's a good reason for that. If there's a photo of a person who's just died, we have ceremonies that we put around that photo. So, does that answer your question?
Kind of. Are there any biometric indicators that don't do that are okay to use, that aren't reflections of, or that would be not kind of ancestral taonga?
No, in terms of anything biological, no. It's all, and every part of the human body, whether it's a DNA or a gene or a hair, has a genealogy all the way back, and there's lots of stories, and everything is sacred.
Yeah.
I think it depends on where you draw the boundaries around what is biometrics. I would say increasingly your cell phone is a biometric marker, right? Even though it is not biological. Yeah, but the ability to track a person based on where the cell phone is moving, I think that would be non-biological. Does that change how you feel about how creepy it is or not?
And Ancestry.com, you providing the police with DNA that's then identified family members for crimes, which is an American use of one interest.
I'm very excited about the group privacy topic there, because we actually, the privacy rights are individual. I mean, it's in law, and every Western law we have individual rights, and privacy is considered an individual one. Well, that's actually with DNA and with Maori data sovereignty, we see that it's actually a collective right. We don't have a tool to address that, the fact, completely, just cross-cutting.
Okay, why don't you back in the booth and you want to ask questions a while? You might have to be loud.
That's all right, I'm a big chap. We talked a lot about privacy, but how will disclosure work? If we look at the way our Artificial Information Act works, things like training sets and algorithms would all be suppressed under privacy or commercial concerns. How would we actually see what government is doing?
The question is how would we see what data we're using to, this is whether all controlled under commercial or government privacy controls?
Yeah, I think the first answer to that is that the Official Information Act isn't going to find you anything because the agencies themselves don't know how the models work or what data is being used because they're just buying something off the shelf. Right?
But there's a right for us to know. There's a wonderful section also. Andrew will know.
Section 23.
Yes. So we have a right to know, they have to respond. But that's not what you said.
But
they'll respond with buying something.
Right. But that's a different question. So Section 23 is rights to reasons for a decision taken affecting you.
Mm.
This is about the ability to check on how are you training the data model. Right? And Andrew's point actually about the fact that these are built by commercial developers and the information is not held by the government agency is more likely to be accurate in my experience.
Karaitiana, you actually mentioned the government data algorithm charter, and I think it's obviously very relevant. Do you want to talk about that a bit more?
Right, so we've recently in the Waitangi Tribunal had a sort of discussion on what should happen, and so essentially what we asked for was that a tutility clause, the government incorporates a tutility clause, and that if they're going to contract out to a commercial agency, that the commercial agency must abide by that tutility clause, and that basically that part of that tutility clause was say, well, how will Māori be impacted by this? So I know that doesn't work for other minorities, but this is it's already a law that we can enact on now.
Okay, we've got about time for about 2 more questions, I think.
Another question.
The first point was more of a comment. I didn't hear it mentioned about hacking. I feel as much as this technology advances, so as does the technology hackers have access to. And sort of at what point does the moratorium end when we decide that we're safe from hacking? Because is there a point where we're ever going to make technology that's completely foolproof? I had another question about political incentives to hide something that could be, facial recognition wise. Somebody could be paid off to be taken away from the data set for political personal reason, something like that. How do we control the integrity of people who hold this?
So basically the integrity of the systems being used, I guess, is what both those questions are about. Anyone want to comment on that?
I would say those concerns are not limited to facial recognition.
Yeah, but I can put this down. I can't take it with me. My credit card, I can choose to catch it, it's been out. But something like my face, like I said, I can't take it off. I can't not go to public space ever. It's not really possible.
And you said also, go to what I did for a sites are as well, actually, so that's the question relates to connect with the system before, and whether or not in this context that's sufficient to protect against the harms that we're concerned about in the sector.
Should be addressed systemically in a way. The second part of the question about political influence. If we have, and we are here in New Zealand, but the political culture is that there is a culture of transparency. These words mandated by security law. And if we put that into law, that we have to show the privacy impact assessment or those agreements which regulate exchange of information between different government agencies and so on. So I'm kind of fan of actually regulating that, mandating mandating the transparency. And hacking is unfortunately a security issue. Unless you put anything well.
Yeah, lucky last question.
I'm curious to know everyone's feelings on the use of facial recognition or similar technologies for the purposes of contact tracing for COVID-19, particularly, for example, in MIQ facilities, where this might be very helpful.
So I'd start by asking Andrew.
My short answer is no. I mean, I've had a lot of concerns around MIQ facilities generally, like that being using thermal cameras, and we don't even use thermal cameras on our actual prisoners. Like, there have to be some bounds on like the rights of people in those facilities. Is there a case to say that facial recognition could help? I'm not sure that it would give any more information than what they already have access to. There are CCTV cameras everywhere. I guess it might speed things up because you don't have to review the footage. But I'll probably feel that that is unacceptably invasive for the people who are in those facilities. That would be a feeling.
For me, it would be definitely a no as well. Again, I mean, there needs to be a consultation to see the considerations. And I know a large amount of Māori who refuse to use the government COVID tracing app because they don't trust the government. So if there's facial recognition involved as well, just make things a lot more.
Okay, we're just going to wrap it up now. Thank you all for coming. Really appreciate that. I'd like to ask you to join the New Zealand Council for Civil Liberties. That's my plug for tonight. And we'll give a round of applause to our panellists, please. You're also welcome to stay and chat. I'm going to go and get into a beer, so I'll be around if anyone wants to give me an opinion or tell me that I'm wrong about something. Otherwise, thanks for coming.